So picture this. It's 1978. A plane full of pilgrims on their way home from the most sacred journey of their lives goes down in a storm. A total tragedy. But that's not even the strangest part. What followed was this bitter international fight over why it happened. And it ended with two official, totally different explanations for the same crash. So how on earth does that happen? Well, let's get into it. Lima 001, you are undershooting. Just think about that. Those are the last words an air traffic controller ever said to this flight. It was a desperate last-ditch warning, but the pilots never heard it. Why? Because in those critical seconds, they'd switched radio frequencies. It's a totally standard procedure, something pilots do all the time. But on this night, that simple, routine action would prove to be absolutely fatal. And this is the human cost of that moment. 183 people. That's not just a number. Those were mothers, fathers, entire families, all returning from a once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage to Mecca. They were almost home, but their homecoming never came.
Okay, so to really grasp the weight of this, you have to understand this wasn't your average flight. This was a Hajj charter. It was packed with people filled with this incredible sense of joy and spiritual fulfillment. And that, of course, just makes what happened next even more heartbreaking.
So here's the route. It was a DC-8 flown by an Icelandic airline called Loftleiðir, bringing a group of Indonesian pilgrims all the way from Jeddah back home to Surabaya. The plan was just a quick stop in Colombo, Sri Lanka for fuel. A short break before the last leg of the trip. But it turned out to be the end of the line. For everyone. And this is where the story gets, well, downright spooky. Get this. This wasn't the first time this had happened. No way. Just 4 years before, another DC-8, also full of Indonesian pilgrims returning from the Hajj, crashed on approach to the exact same airport. I mean, look at the similarities. It's an almost unbelievable, chilling repeat of history. So the big question is, how could lightning strike twice in the exact same spot? To find out, we have to look really closely at the plane's final moments, breaking down exactly what went wrong as it flew into that storm. All right, let's walk through the last 40 seconds. At 23:27, everything seems fine. The crew gets the all clear to land. They say, "Roger that," and just like they're supposed to, they switch their radio over to the tower frequency. But at that exact moment, the approach controller is looking at his radar and sees them dropping way too low, way too fast. He yells out that warning we talked about, but it's too late. They're on another channel. And just 37 seconds, that's it. After getting cleared to land, the plane slams into a plantation more than 2 kilometers short of the runway. Disasters like this are almost never about one single mistake. It's always a chain of failures. And this was a textbook example. First, the runway's approach lights were out of service. In a storm at night, that's a huge problem. Then you've got thunderstorms brewing, which means the risk of dangerous wind shear is high. And finally, you have that perfectly timed fatal frequency switch that cut the pilots off right when they needed that warning the most. It was just one thing after another, lining up for a disaster. So after the crash, everyone wants answers, right? But what they found wasn't a clear-cut cause. Instead, the investigation just fractured. It turned into this huge battle of blame, pitting the Sri Lankan authorities against the investigators from Iceland and the US. And here's what that looked like. On one side, you have the official Sri Lankan report, which basically said it was the crew's fault. They claimed the pilots came in too fast and just didn't follow the proper procedures. But on the other side, the Icelandic and American teams said no way. They blamed the airport, saying a faulty instrument landing system guided the plane into the ground, ATC gave confusing instructions, and those broken runway lights left the pilots flying blind. 2 totally different conclusions. So you've got 2 official reports that completely contradict each other. The whole thing's a mess. But later on, a new theory emerged, pointing to a third culprit, an invisible killer that, back then, people in aviation were only just starting to understand. And that culprit is something called a microburst. Okay, so what is that? The simplest way to think about it is like an invisible waterfall of air just slamming down out of a thunderstorm. If a plane flies into that, it gets pushed towards the ground with incredible force. It's unbelievably dangerous, and back in 1978, pilots and controllers just didn't know how serious a threat it really was. Which brings up a really interesting possibility, right? Could a microburst be the missing piece of the puzzle here? Could it be the thing that forced the plane down so hard and so fast that it made the pilot's actions seem like an error? and at the same time made the broken equipment on the ground a fatal problem. It's a fascinating idea because it doesn't really prove one side wrong. It kind of suggests they were both right. Look, we might never know for sure who or what was most to blame, but what we do know is that this tragedy, especially coming right after the Martiner crash, left a powerful legacy. A legacy that was forged in fire, but one that ultimately made flying safer for everyone.
Having two nearly identical crashes in just 4 years was a huge wake-up call that nobody could ignore. It put a massive spotlight on the weaknesses at the Colombo airport, and the result? Sri Lanka had to completely overhaul its aviation rules. They poured money into upgrading their navigation aids and safety systems to make sure nothing like this could ever happen again.
And you have to remember, for a country as small as Iceland, this loss was just catastrophic. It remains, to this very day, the single deadliest accident in the nation's entire aviation history. A truly dark day that's never been forgotten. And that really leaves us with a final big question. In any disaster, where do we draw the line between finding someone to blame and actually learning the lesson? The story of Flight 001 is all about failures compounding on each other, human, technical, and even natural. And maybe its biggest lesson is that safety isn't about preventing a single mistake. It's about understanding how a whole chain of small things can link up to create a catastrophe, and then working to break that chain.